From the outside, Vanessa's life looked picture perfect. Raised in an affluent white family in suburban Connecticut, she had everything: horseback riding lessons, summers in Cape Cod, private schools with ivy-covered walls, and a mother who wore pearls and red lipstick even while gardening. Her world was made of country clubs, classical music recitals, and polite dinner parties where no one ever raised their voice. But behind that pristine image, something never quite fit. Vanessa always felt different. She could never explain it in words. It wasn't just the color of her skin, which was darker than anyone else's in her family, or the way her hair curled tightly when everyone else's fell straight and fine. It wasn't even the strangers who asked if she was adopted, or the teachers who raised an eyebrow when reading her name from the attendance sheet. It was a quiet, haunting feeling that lived deep in her chest, a sense that something about her life wasn't real, like she was playing a part in someone else's story. Her mother always brushed off the questions. "Oh, her father had some Creole in him," she'd say with a tight smile, or "she takes after a distant relative on my mother's side." Vanessa wanted to believe her. She needed to believe her, because the alternative, that she didn't belong, was far too terrifying. But then there were the inconsistencies, the missing baby photos, the evasive answers when she asked about her birth, the way her mother once recoiled just slightly when Vanessa said she sometimes felt like she didn't come from them. Tiny moments, easy to dismiss until they weren't. Years passed. Vanessa built a life of her own, successful, educated, surrounded by friends who loved her for who she was. But that quiet ache never fully left. So one night at a dinner party, someone joked about doing one of those DNA tests. "Let's see who's got Viking blood," a friend laughed. Vanessa joined in, not thinking much of it. Just for fun, she thought, just to settle some curiosity. She didn't expect the test to shatter her entire world. The results came in during a live stream, just something light-hearted to share with her followers. Her friends giggled as they read their ancestries out loud. Irish, German, Scandinavian. Then came Vanessa's silence, her heritage. 100% sub-Saharan African. No trace of European lineage. None. The air in the room changed. She laughed nervously, refreshing the screen. Maybe it was a glitch, but it was. It was the truth. In that moment, her entire identity collapsed. Every story she had been told, every photo framed on the wall, every "I love you" from the woman who raised her, suddenly felt like a well-rehearsed lie. She didn't just feel out of place anymore. She was out of place. The question wasn't just "who am I?" It was "how did this happen?" The search for answers led her down a path darker than she imagined. Hospital records sealed for decades, inconsistencies in her birth certificate, whispers from former nurses, and a single name that kept coming up: a white socialite with ties to the hospital where Vanessa was born. And then, the unthinkable. A baby switched, a secret kept, a life stolen. 30 years later, that secret would be dragged into the light live on national television. One woman would finally be forced to answer. Why did she take a child that wasn't hers? And Vanessa, standing in front of the world, would ask the question that had haunted her for a lifetime. Who would I have been if you hadn't taken me? Long before DNA results shattered her reality, Vanessa was the girl who had it all. At least that's what everyone told her. Her house sat at the end of a winding, tree-lined street, where every lawn looked manicured by hand and mailboxes were monogrammed with gold initials. Inside, everything gleamed: polished floors, classical paintings, chandeliers. Her mother, Caroline Prescott, was the kind of woman who appeared in society magazines, not for scandal, but for charity galas and garden parties. Her world was orderly, elegant, predictable. Vanessa's days were filled with French lessons, violin recitals, and horseback riding on the weekends. She was the golden child, or so it seemed. But Vanessa wasn't golden, not in the way they meant. She didn't have the porcelain skin, the flaxen hair, the icy blue eyes that were almost expected in the Prescott lineage. Her curls were tighter, her skin several shades deeper than anyone else's at her school. At age 6, she noticed how the family portraits never included her. At 10, she realized her cousins whispered about her when they thought she wasn't listening. By 13, she began to understand what they meant when they said she was unique, special, or worse, so well-spoken. Her mother always dismissed it. People love to talk. Ignore them, she'd say with a smile too tight to be comforting. But Vanessa couldn't ignore the look in her mother's eyes when reporters came too close, or when an old family friend made an offhand remark about her beautiful tan. There was always a brief flicker, panic perhaps, shame, or something else entirely. Still, Vanessa tried to belong. She straightened her hair, wore pastels, learned to smile in that restrained, polite way that society girls do. She never rebelled, never questioned the narrative she'd been handed. To the world, she was Caroline Prescott's daughter, poised, educated, privileged. And part of her clung to that image, even when the cracks began to form. The first real crack came at age 15. It was a winter formal. Vanessa was excited. She had the dress, the shoes, even a date. But when she arrived at the venue, the doorman looked her up and down and said, "Staff entrance is around the back." Her date laughed it off, but she didn't. She stood frozen, heart sinking, realizing the man hadn't been rude, he'd been certain she didn't belong. And for a moment, Vanessa wondered if he was right. But the questions, the real ones, didn't take root until her 20s. Away from home, living on her own, she began to see her upbringing through a different lens. The absence of family photos, the way her mother deflected when asked about her birth, the fact that her birth certificate looked different, altered. She chalked it up to bureaucracy. Hospitals mess things up all the time, right? But deep down, something gnawed at her. She started to ask herself hard questions. If her mother was so proud, why did she never talk about Vanessa's childhood? Why were there no stories of her birth, no traditions passed down, no bedtime tales about when you were a baby? Most families, she realized, had roots. Hers felt like a beautifully decorated stage set, gorgeous on the outside, but hollow once you looked behind the curtains. She began to journal, to process, and most importantly, to listen to that quiet voice she'd been trained to silence since childhood. The one that said, "This life isn't really yours." Still, despite the doubt, she held on. Because letting go of that identity, of that life of safety, comfort, wealth, meant stepping into the unknown. And the unknown is terrifying. But fate doesn't wait for permission. When that DNA test arrived in her inbox years later, it didn't just reveal her heritage. It tore the mask off everything she thought was true. The perfect life she'd fought to protect wasn't perfect. It was perfectly constructed, perfectly curated, and perfectly false. The little girl in the big white house was never supposed to be there. And now, 30 years later, she was about to find out why. Vanessa had always lived with a quiet question buried somewhere deep inside her. But for most of her life, she never dared to say it out loud. She learned to ignore it, to silence the subtle dissonance that hummed beneath the surface of her perfect life. And for a while, it worked. The ballet classes, the weekend brunches, the polite conversations at fundraisers, all of it helped keep the doubt at bay. But one afternoon, with a few friends crowded around her kitchen island, laughing and teasing over a bottle of wine, that quiet question found its way back to the surface. "Let's all do one of those DNA tests," someone said, grinning. "See who's secretly descended from royalty." It was lighthearted, harmless, just another spontaneous plan fueled by weekend boredom. They all agreed, laughing as they ordered the kits. When hers arrived, Vanessa didn't hesitate. She followed the instructions, sealed the tube, mailed it off, and forgot about it. She wasn't expecting much, maybe some French or Italian ancestry, a surprise sliver of something exotic to explain away the questions she'd fielded all her life. She definitely wasn't expecting what came next. When the results email arrived 2 weeks later, it was a slow Sunday morning. The apartment was quiet, sunlight pouring in through the windows. She clicked the link lazily, with the same anticipation as flipping through a horoscope, curious but not serious. The screen loaded. 100% sub-Saharan African. She stared. For a long time she didn't move. Then she laughed, uneasy, refreshing the page as if it had made a mistake. But the numbers didn't change. No French, no English, no Irish or German. Not a single trace of the heritage she'd been told she carried her entire life. It didn't make sense. It didn't even feel real. 100 thoughts rushed through her mind. Was there a lab error? Did they mix up her results? She scoured forums, emailed customer support, looked for similar stories. But the test was accurate, scientifically sound, reputable. There was no mistake. And slowly something settled in her chest. Not clarity, something colder, heavier. A weight she couldn't name yet, but one that pulled her to the edge of everything she thought she knew. Because if the test was right, if she had no European ancestry at all, then she wasn't her mother's daughter. Not by blood, not by chance, not in any biological sense. She tried to remember if anyone had ever mentioned adoption. No. There were no papers, no origin stories, no tales of being chosen. There was only silence, dodged questions, and that strange, unspoken tension that had followed her since childhood. What came next wasn't planned. It was instinct. She dove into research, losing sleep and forgetting meals, chasing breadcrumbs across public records and hospital archives. At first, it was aimless, just one woman looking for a story to explain her own. But then, deep in a forgotten blog post from a retired nurse, she found a whisper of something darker. The nurse didn't name names, but she spoke of a case from 1995. A white woman, wealthy, furious, demanding a child that wasn't biologically hers. There had been confusion, suspicion, but no investigation. And just like that, it was covered up, forgotten, until now. Vanessa's pulse quickened, the hospital matched, the year matched, the timeline aligned with her own birth. A horrible thought formed. What if she hadn't been adopted but taken? Her hands shook as she searched deeper. Newspaper archives, hospital staff rosters, donation records. And there she was, Caroline Prescott, listed as a major donor to the hospital the same year Vanessa was born. A name too precise to be coincidence. The ache she had carried for years was no longer vague. It had a shape, a face, and a story. Her identity wasn't just confused, it had been deliberately replaced. The woman who raised her may not have just taken her in. She may have taken her. For Vanessa, the DNA test didn't just reveal where she came from. It exposed the depth of what had been hidden and what had been stolen. Her childhood, her culture, her bloodline. Gone. Rewritten under the name of a woman who had carefully crafted a lie, one smile and pearl necklace at a time. And now that lie had cracked open. She didn't know who her real mother was. She didn't know what had really happened in that hospital room 30 years ago. But one thing was clear. Her story wasn't over. It was just beginning. In the days following the DNA test, Vanessa found herself drifting in and out of thought like a ghost haunting her own memories. Everything felt unreal. The people she called family, the house she'd once believed to be her home, even the name she carried. Nothing made sense anymore. And yet, the deeper truth wasn't just about who she was. It was about what had been hidden from her and by whom. She didn't want closure. She wanted clarity. She wanted answers. So she did what she had always done when something didn't sit right. She started asking questions. The hospital was her first stop, or at least she thought it would be. She called calmly at first, requesting her full birth records. The voice on the other end sounded polite, rehearsed, a little too quick to say no. "Those records are sealed," they said. "You need legal authorization." When she asked who could authorize it, the answer came fast and final: only next of kin or a court order. The call ended just like that. It wasn't a dead end. It was a door slammed shut. But Vanessa wasn't going to stop there. She dug deeper, channeling all the instincts that had made her good at her job: pattern recognition, persistence, and an unshakable sense of what didn't belong. She filed formal records requests, searched old birth announcements, scoured public databases and even dark corners of the internet where long-lost adoptees shared leads and desperate parents told stories no one else would listen to. She wasn't just looking for proof anymore. She was looking for the beginning of the real story. And then she found something. It was almost nothing. A brief mention in an anonymous blog post by a retired nurse who had once worked in neonatal care. The post described strange incidents from the mid-90s, hospital mistakes quietly swept under the rug, and one story in particular caught her breath. A white woman, wealthy, demanding to take home a baby that didn't match her own medical records. The nurse had written, she screamed until someone made it happen. There was no name, no specific hospital, but the timing matched, the circumstances matched. Vanessa's gut twisted. Somehow she knew this was her. The more she searched, the more the pattern emerged. Her supposed mother, Caroline Prescott, had donated to the hospital's expansion wing the same year Vanessa was born. A hefty sum, enough to make problems disappear, enough to buy silence. Still, one question haunted her more than any other. If she had been taken, then whose child was she, really? She began to trace births from that same hospital on that same day. She filtered through archived documents, records that took weeks to track down, often arriving half-redacted or incomplete. But then she found it. A baby girl born just minutes apart from her, listed with a different name, Ayanna Brooks. The surname didn't match anyone in the Prescott family. The mother's name was unfamiliar, but something in Vanessa's chest stirred. She copied the name into a search engine, found a woman living in Atlanta, brown skin, soft, searching eyes. The resemblance was undeniable, not to Caroline, but to herself. She stared at the photos for hours before working up the courage to send a message. "Hi, Yana. I know this may sound strange, but I believe we were born on the same day in the same hospital. And I think something went terribly wrong." The response didn't come immediately. Hours passed, then a day, then two. Finally, Ayanna replied, "My mom always said she didn't feel like I was hers, that something was off. She begged the nurses to double check, but they told her she was just confused." Vanessa read the words over and over, heart pounding in her ears. The puzzle pieces began to fall into place, not all at once, but with terrifying clarity. Ayanna had grown up in a modest black family in Georgia. Her mother had fought to keep food on the table, always saying, "I don't know why I feel like I lost something the day you were born." All this time, Ayanna had wondered about her beginnings too, but never imagined this. Together, the two women began to reconstruct what might have happened. Two babies, one born to privilege, one born into struggle, switched whether by accident or intent. And two mothers, one who may have known the truth and kept it hidden, and another who knew something was wrong but was never given the power to prove it. What had seemed like a conspiracy theory now looked more like a buried crime. Vanessa gathered everything she could: screenshots, timelines, DNA comparisons. She brought it to a journalist she trusted, someone who'd investigated hospital malpractice before. The story was met with quiet disbelief at first, but the evidence was there. Real, chilling. More calls were made, more records surfaced. Anonymous hospital staff confirmed whispers of cover-ups, favors exchanged, cases like Vanessa's being handled privately. And time again, one name returned to the center of it all: Caroline Prescott. She had influence. She had money. And 3 decades ago, she had walked out of a hospital holding a baby that did not belong to her. Vanessa stared at the ceiling one night, unable to sleep, tears drying on her cheeks. For so long, she had been told her life was a gift, that she was lucky. But now she understood something far more painful. She hadn't been lucky. She had been chosen, and someone else had been erased. It began with a phone call Vanessa never expected to answer. A national morning show, one of those glossy, high-profile talk programs that usually covered celebrity gossip and human interest stories, had gotten wind of her case. The producer's voice was warm, cautious, intrigued. They had seen the evidence. The journalist she'd partnered with had shared the outline of the story, and now they wanted to bring it to the public. Not in print, not in silence, but live. A face-to-face segment, a confrontation, and they wanted Caroline Prescott to be there. Vanessa hesitated. Every part of her wanted answers, but did she want them in front of millions of people? Could she really stand across from the woman who raised her, who tucked her in at night and tied bows in her hair, and ask, "Why did you steal me?" But this wasn't about comfort anymore. It was about truth, about justice. So she said yes. The days leading up to the taping blurred together. Ayanna flew in to support her. The producers coached Vanessa on how to keep her composure, how to speak her truth clearly but gently. But nothing, no rehearsal, no outline, no Showtime countdown, could have prepared her for what it would feel like to walk into that studio and see Caroline sitting under the stage lights. Legs crossed, expression cool, unshaken. She looked the same, perfectly put together. A crisp beige blazer, pearls at her neck, a smile so practiced it almost passed for love. But behind the cameras, Vanessa saw what she hadn't allowed herself to believe until now. This was a woman who had stolen a life and never looked back. The segment began. The host introduced the story. A case of mistaken identity, or perhaps something darker. 2 babies born on the same day. 2 families forever altered. A daughter seeking the truth. And then came the moment. Vanessa walked onto the stage. For a beat, neither of them spoke. Vanessa took her seat across from Caroline, their eyes meeting in a silence heavy with history. The host gently posed the first question. "Caroline, are you aware of what the DNA evidence shows?" Caroline nodded, her voice calm. "I've seen it," she said. "It was surprising." Vanessa's jaw tightened. Surprising, that was all. "And how do you explain it?" The host asked. "Vanessa is not your biological child. Her ancestry is 100% sub-Saharan African. Yours is not." Caroline hesitated for just a moment before answering. "I didn't intend to hurt anyone. I was desperate. We had tried for years to have children. There was an error at the hospital, and when I held her, I just knew. I couldn't let go." Vanessa's voice cracked as she finally spoke. "You knew I wasn't your child. You knew from the beginning, didn't you?" Caroline looked at her, softly, almost sadly. "I knew you weren't mine by blood, but I loved you as if you were." "That's not love," Vanessa said, louder now, her voice trembling. "Love doesn't erase someone else's child. Love doesn't take a baby from her real mother and pretend nothing happened." Caroline's facade faltered. "You had everything," she said, almost pleading. "I gave you a beautiful life." Vanessa shook her head. "No, you gave yourself a beautiful lie, and you made me live in it." The room was silent. The audience held its breath. Ayanna, seated off-stage, wiped her eyes. She knew what it felt like to grow up without answers. But Vanessa, she had grown up with the wrong ones. Vanessa continued, her voice steadier now. I don't hate you, but I need you to understand this wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. You chose not to come forward. You chose not to tell me. You chose your comfort over my truth. Caroline's hands rested stiffly on her lap. Her mouth opened, then closed. There was nothing left to say. The host stepped in gently. Caroline, have you ever considered reaching out to the biological family who lost their daughter? Caroline looked down. I was afraid, she admitted. I didn't want to lose her. I didn't want to face what I'd done. The weight of those words settled across the room. This was no longer about blame. It was about truth. And on that stage, under the harsh lights of national television, the truth stood undeniable. When the cameras cut to commercial, Vanessa rose quietly. She didn't storm off. She didn't cry. She simply walked past the woman who had pretended to be her mother for 3 decades, her shoulders straight, her heart pounding. Behind her, the crowd was silent. Outside the studio, the air felt different, lighter, realer. Ayanna met her at the curb and pulled her into a long, quiet hug. No words were needed. They both knew what had been stolen would never fully be returned, but something new was forming in its place. And for the first time in her life, Vanessa knew she was walking away not from a family, but from a lie. The days after the broadcast were a blur. Headlines exploded across the internet: stolen at birth, heir to a lie, daughter confronts socialite who raised her on TV. Vanessa's inbox flooded with thousands of messages. Support, disbelief, outrage, even strangers who said they saw parts of themselves in her. But beneath the noise and viral headlines, Vanessa felt strangely quiet. It wasn't peace exactly. It was something else, like silence after a storm where everything is still standing but nothing looks the same. She didn't regret confronting Caroline. If anything, she wished she had done it sooner. But it hadn't brought closure, not yet. The confrontation had exposed the lie, yes, but the wound it left behind was deeper than she expected. What do you do when your entire past becomes a question mark? What do you hold on to when the people who raised you were never really yours? She found herself thinking more and more about Ayanna, about the life they should have lived side by side, as sisters or friends, maybe even switching shoes at school, sleeping in the same nursery. Instead, they were raised worlds apart. Ayanna had grown up with love, yes, but not ease. She had to fight harder for everything. She didn't have trust funds or tennis lessons. She had grit and hustle and a mother who had never stopped believing that something had been taken from her. That woman, Ayanna's real mother, was Vanessa's biological mother, too. Meeting her for the first time was nothing like a movie. There were no violins, no perfect hugs, no tidy emotional resolution. It happened in a small cafe on the edge of Atlanta. Her name was Denise. She walked in slowly, carefully, as if trying not to shatter the moment by moving too fast. Vanessa stood to greet her, unsure whether to hug or cry or say nothing at all. In the end, she just whispered, "Hi," and Denise reached out and took her hand. They talked for hours, about everything, and yet about almost nothing. There were no answers that could undo the past, no apology that could fill the 30 years lost, but there was presence, there was warmth, and there was recognition, not of memories but of mirrors. They had the same laugh, the same way of furrowing their brows when thinking, the same rhythm in their voice when telling a story. Vanessa learned that Denise had never stopped asking questions, that she had written letters to the hospital, that she had demanded explanations, that she had been ignored, dismissed, patronized. Her grief was quiet, but it never left her. When she saw Vanessa's face on TV, she said it felt like remembering a song she hadn't heard since the day she gave birth. In the weeks that followed, Vanessa spent more time with Denise and Ayanna. At first, it was awkward. The rhythms were unfamiliar. They didn't have old photos together, family traditions, or inside jokes, but there was no pretending, no lies. And that, Vanessa realized, was what made it real. She started going through things slowly, journaling, therapy, even returning to the old Prescott home to gather what belonged to her. Caroline had left town, or maybe just disappeared behind closed doors. Vanessa didn't follow up. There was nothing left to say. Instead, she focused on discovering who she was outside the life that had been built for her. She began learning about her heritage, not the version curated for her at prep school, but the real history. West African traditions, civil rights legacies, food, music, names, ancestors. She took dance classes in Harlem. She joined a genealogy group for displaced children. She started cooking with Denise, learning how to make cornbread from scratch, watching her hands move with memory and love. And for the first time, her reflection in the mirror didn't feel like a question. It felt like a beginning. There were still hard days. Days when grief hit her like a wave, grief for the years lost, for the girl she could have been, for the mother who never got to raise her. But there were good days too. Days filled with small laughter, quiet joy, the slow rebuilding of something more honest than the life she'd known before. Vanessa had once lived in a house of glass, clean, expensive, and hollow. Now she was building something slower, something real, not perfect, but hers. And in that messy, beautiful becoming, she found something Caroline could never give her. In the quiet after everything, after the cameras stopped rolling, after the interviews faded, after the story stopped trending, Vanessa found herself staring at the ceiling one night, trying to name the emotion sitting heavy on her chest. It wasn't anger, not anymore. It wasn't even sadness. It was something else. A quiet ache, maybe. The kind that settles in when you realize you've lived an entire life shaped by a truth you never had the chance to choose. She thought the confrontation would bring closure, that uncovering the truth would deliver some final sense of justice. But the truth, she learned, doesn't end anything. It begins everything. She now understood that healing wasn't a destination. It was a process. It wasn't about making peace with the past, but learning how to carry it without letting it crush you. And for Vanessa, that meant reclaiming not only her identity, but her story on her own terms. What happened to her may seem rare, even extreme, but the deeper she listened to others, the more she realized her story echoed through far more lives than she imagined. People reached out with whispers they'd held for decades, questions about their origins, families that never quite made sense, histories shaped by silence. Some had stories like hers. Others just had a feeling that something was missing, that they didn't fully belong to the narrative written for them. And it made her wonder, how many of us are walking through life carrying names that don't reflect who we are, traditions that don't trace back to where we came from? How many of us inherit not just blood, but confusion, secrets, and unanswered questions? Vanessa's story became a mirror, and it taught her that uncovering the truth isn't just an act of personal liberation. It's an act of courage for yourself and for those who never had the power to ask. She knows now that the lie she lived in wasn't built overnight. It was built quietly through small choices, through systems designed to protect comfort, not accountability. And so the work of undoing that lie would have to be equally deliberate, gentle, but relentless. Not everyone will be switched at birth. Not everyone will uncover a headline-worthy secret. But everyone, at some point, must decide whether to accept the story they were handed or start writing their own. So if you're reading this, maybe now is the time to ask the questions you've avoided, to call the relative who always dodged that one part of the story, to open the drawer with the old letters, to listen more closely to the ache that won't leave you alone. Because the real danger isn't in what you might find. The real danger is in never looking. Vanessa once thought her past defined her. Now she knows. It's what she chooses to do with that truth that truly makes her who she is. And that choice belongs to all of us.